So tonight we're in Isaiah chapter 50, end of 52 through chapter 53. And this is the longest of the servant songs of Isaiah. Perhaps you remember that there are 4 of them. This is the 4th one. This is the longest one. And this is the one that, everything is moving towards. You can tell as you read through the book of Isaiah that chapter 53 is really the climax toward which everything is moving in this section of the scripture. We're anticipating salvation, and here God is going to explain to us really how in the world he's going to manage this. You remember back beginning in chapter 40, we started this major new section of the book of Isaiah. And so chapters 40 to 48, we have God wants to deliver, he's able to deliver, and he will deliver his people from exile. But then in beginning in chapter 49, we begin a section where we have God will deliver not just from exile, but God will deliver Israel from sin. And they really need to be delivered from sin because, after all, it was sin that got them into exile in the first place. And if God doesn't do something about it, they're going to be right back here again in a few generations, because we all know what mankind is like. So the question is, how in the world is God going to bring salvation, to take care of the sin problem that people have? If he just simply says, okay, fine, you've been in exile for 70 years, that's good, I'll forgive you. That's not really justice, is it? And so how is God going to be just as well as be forgiving? And that's the mystery that we're going to delve deep into tonight. And the deeper we go, the more we see that it is deeper still than we can possibly go. The book of Isaiah 52 and 53 is quoted more frequently in the New Testament than any other New Testament passage. So we see that the first Christians as well thought that Isaiah 52, 53 was really, really super important. Okay, so let's take a look at something about the structure of this section, beginning with 52:13 through 53, verse 12. Now, there are 5 stanzas in this song. And it happens in our English translation that there are 3 verses in each one of those stanzas. And each stanza gets progressively longer. So you see that the first stanza has 9 lines, the second has 10, the third has 12, the fourth has 13, and the 5th stanza has 14 lines. And so just by the structure of the song, we see that the final stanza is really the goal. That's the pinnacle of the song. And so he's arranged his material climactically. We begin with the worldwide impact of the servant of God. And the next stanza is how he is humble and despised. In the 3rd stanza, we see that he is punished for others. In the 4th stanza, we see that his death is unjust. And finally, in that last stanza, we see the ultimate victory of God. It's interesting that the song begins with a commendation from God when he says, "My servant will act wisely." And it ends similarly, "I will give him a portion among the great." All right. And poor Steve has joined us, but we have no audio for Steve. I hope he figures this out. Okay, so in this song, we see 2 contrasts. We see the contrast between the servant's exaltation and his suffering. First of all, it begins and ends with his worldwide impact and ends with his ultimate victory. But in between, we have this detailed description of the suffering of the servant of God. And then we also have a contrast between what people thought of the servant of God and what was really true. And we're going to see that as we go along here as well. So I'm wondering if I could get someone to read for me 52:13 through 15. I'm looking for someone who maybe has is not muted, so to read for me. Wally, could you read for me 52:13 to the end of the chapter?
Sure. Start with verse 13.
Yes, please.
Start with what verse do I start with?
13.
Okay.
52:13.
I'll hear that well. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, just as there were many who were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?
Let's go ahead and stop.
Do I stop there?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So this psalm begins with this call to pay attention. See, my servant. Where am I at? I'm so sorry. See, my servant will act wisely. To act wisely means he's going to have success. All right. We also read in verse 13 that he will be high and lifted up. Now, this expression of high and lifted up is found 4 times in the book of Isaiah and nowhere else in any other part of the Bible. And every other time, it's a reference to God. Okay. So this is a clue here as to who the servant is, in case you were wondering. It's a clue that we're really talking about God, actually, here. Now, verse 14. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, that it's almost like we have a parenthesis. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form was marred beyond human likeness. Marred or disfigured. So this is a term that is used of a blemished animal. So this is the kind of animal that was not appropriate for sacrifice. Interesting. But, so he was disfigured beyond recognition. He was totally blemished. And then verse 15 says, so he will sprinkle many nations. Now, that's rather an odd translation, isn't it? So he will sprinkle many nations. And there are other translations actually here. We could be translated as he will startle many nations. And that's actually the way it's translated in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And in a sense, it makes more sense here to say he'll startle many nations. It's more parallel with the other phrase in the verse, the kings will shut their mouths. Okay. So this servant will startle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. So the basic thrust of verses 14 and 15 is that the nations will be shocked, speechless by what they see in God's servant. What they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. And so they will be just as surprised at his ultimate victory as at his appalling suffering. All right, we're going to read chapter 53, verses 1 through 3.
Oh, finally got that.
Whoa.
Sorry it was so late.
Okay, we got two of you, Steve.
Oh.
All right, so we'll work it out.
Well, I tried to install on my computer, and I don't know. I didn't know you had to download an app, and I thought it'd be on the website or something. So I'm back on my iPhone. We've done it with the laptop. Yeah. So.
Okay, well, good deal. So, Nick, do you suppose you could read 53, 1 through 3 for me?
Who?
Could you read that for me, Rick?
Oh, Rick's on there.
Okay.
Huh?
This is verses 1 through 3 of chapter 53.
Okay, 53, 1 through 3. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not.
Thank you. All right. So, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? So all through this whole section of Isaiah has created an expectation that God's mighty arm. In fact, just a few verses before, 52:10 says, "The Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God." And so the readers were expecting to have some great show of God's power and might. But could they ever have imagined that it would look like this? That the God's power and might would look like someone who was disfigured and appalling and ugly. Is that what they were expecting? No. In fact, the Gospel of John uses this verse in this very way. It says in John 12, even after Jesus had done all these miraculous signs in their presence, they still would not believe him. And this was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet. Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? It just did not make sense. This was not what they expected. All right.
They're talking about Jesus, the rejection of Jesus, this whole chapter 53.
Well, so here's the thing. Isaiah does not reveal the identity of this servant, does he?
That's what I got to note. Yeah.
Anywhere in this passage, he does not reveal the servant's identity. And I'm sure that the children of Israel, the Jewish people, as they read this in the years between Isaiah's writing of the book and Christ's coming, they would have read this and they would have had real questions as to who in the world this is. They would know that, at one point, Isaiah had said, the servant of the Lord is Israel. And so perhaps this servant here is some idealized form of Israel, and then in a sense that is true. They also would look at the passages in Isaiah that had to do with the Messiah, and he was going to be the son of David, and he was going to the government would be on his shoulders, and they would put these things together, and they would say this servant perhaps is the Messiah that God has promised. But they certainly did not recognize Jesus when he came as the Messiah and as the Son of God.
Mhm.
Now, those of us on this side of the cross can look back and see clearly, absolutely, there is no doubt that we're talking about Jesus. But that would not have been the case before.
Okay.
And even, Isaiah, a godly man, a prophet of God, he was looking to try to figure out what God was doing, but he couldn't see clearly because God had not yet revealed it.
Yep.
So we can say, yes, we're talking about Jesus, but Isaiah is not saying that yet because Isaiah doesn't know.
Okay.
Right? So he's just revealing little bits and little bits and little bits, and then we get the whole picture because we're on this side. Now, he says here, he grew up like a tender shoot. Well, so there are a couple of implications from that. One is that the Messiah, we are told, would grow up from the stump of Jesse. So this servant is identified with the one who grew up from the stump of Jesse. But also, he was just a little bit of vegetation, for goodness sakes. You walk along the path, there's this little plant there. Who really cares? You can step on it, and you wouldn't even notice the difference. And so the nature of the servant's entire ministry was just totally unexpected from the human point of view. He's described as like a root out of dry ground. Well, for goodness sakes, nobody attaches any significance to a root out of dry ground. I mean, if you're walking along the path through the field and there's a little bit of wheat that's been pulled up by the root, well, you don't think anything of it because it's going to die. It's going to wither away and just blow away. And when Jesus was growing up as a lad in Nazareth, no one particularly took any real note of him, did they? He was just, an ordinary kid running around. And so that's what people were viewing this servant of God. We're also told that he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. He had no beauty or majesty. This is the same word that was used of David. Although David had it. He said David was a fine looking man. He had majesty, he had beauty, but not this servant of God. So Jesus didn't have any real bearing. Beauty was considered to be a prerequisite for greatness, but Jesus had none of that. His intrinsic beauty was hidden, and the people couldn't see it because they were looking on the outside. Right? Verse 3 says, he was despised and rejected by men. So the word despise is very strong in English. It has a real sense of emotional contempt. The Hebrew word doesn't really carry quite such an emotional sense, but rather it connotes a hasty dismissal. He was dismissed. No big deal. He was dismissed and rejected. And we read that he was a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Man of sorrow, suffering, familiar with pain. So both physical and mental pain. He was an abject, pitiful figure. He was not one of the winners. He was one of the losers in life. And not that he was truly such, but that was the understanding of the world, the extreme misunderstanding of him. So here we have, remember I said one of the contrasts we see in this chapter is the contrast between what people thought of him and what he really was. And that's really coming into focus here. All of this, the way we saw Jesus, we're going to see that that wasn't really the way he was. Yeah. He was like one from whom men hide their faces. On the cross, not only was he unattractive, but he was repulsive. He did not even look human after his trial, the ordeal of his trial. He was just a mass of unsightly flesh. And in verse 3, we held him in low esteem. That's the way we looked at him. We judged him to be insignificant. He doesn't even merit a second thought. Then we move into verses 4 through 6 that tell us that he was punished, but not for himself. He was punished for others. David, could you read 53 verses 4 through 6?
Lily, no. Yeah.
I don't know. David?
Yeah, I'll do that.
6.
Sure. So beginning with verse 4. Yet it was our weaknesses he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. And we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins. But he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's paths to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all.
All right. So verse 4 begins with this extreme contrast. Surely he took up our infirmities and he carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten and afflicted. This surely it's a strong contrast. It means, but in fact, we saw him as being nothing, but in fact, he wasn't being smitten by God. He wasn't being afflicted by God. He was carrying our transgressions and our infirmities. There was nothing wrong with him. All was wrong with us. So verses 1 through 3 has given us our pitiful human misunderstanding of this servant. And verses 4 through 6 shows the world's sudden realization of the truth of who this servant truly is. Look at all of those words in verses 4 and 5 that emphasize the pain and the anguish that he experienced. He was stricken, smitten, afflicted, pierced, crushed, punishment, wounds, all of those heavy words, and they all fell on this servant of God. We considered that he was stricken by God. Well, that was the people's initial wrong conclusion, that Jesus was suffering the punishment of God for his own sins. Notice in verse 4 we have
Infirmaries.
we have well, NIV says infirmities and sorrows, or it can be pain and suffering. And that's a reverse of what we had in verse 3, where we had suffering and pain. So the author is showing his poetic abilities by having a reversal of what? The pain and suffering in verse 4 is a reversal of the suffering and pain in verse 3. So the suffering and pain that made us think little of him, really it was our pain and suffering. And all this language of carrying, he took up and he bore. And that hints at the substitutionary nature of the servant's suffering that's going to be brought out even more clearly later on. So he's not suffering with his people, but he's suffering for them. Then in verse 4, we have these words like stricken and afflicted. These are terms of illness. Sometimes you say, oh, this person was stricken with leprosy. So yeah, it's a term of illness. And the world incorrectly assumed that God was visiting on the servant the affliction that he truly deserved. He was pierced and he was crushed. And here are those images now of illness changed to images of injury. And they become even more severe. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. So finally, the truth is becoming clear. The servant not only receives the unjust punishment for our sin, but gives us back undeserved well-being. Then we have verse 6, that is the one that we all know, right? All we like sheep have gone astray. And so this verse begins with we all, and it ends with us all. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. You know, I'm never going to forget an experience that I had a long time ago going to hear Handel's Messiah. And it was the first time I had heard the whole Messiah, all 3 hours of it in one setting. And so some of you are familiar with the Messiah. And I could see, you know, what was coming up. And I saw that we had this verse, all we like sheep have gone astray. And I thought, now this is going to be heavy. It's going to be just really, really deep and morose and just in a minor key. And it's going to be just hard to bear. I didn't have the score. I had not said it yet. And the orchestra started in. And any of you who know the piece, I was absolutely shocked because it starts off, oh, we like sheep, have gone astray. And so the sopranos are kind of wandering off into their own little stratosphere, and the bass are kind of wandering off down in the bushes somewhere, and everybody is just kind of meandering all around, and they're just having a gay old time. And then you get to the line that says, we have turned, and it's like we're just having a great happy time. And I'm back there saying, this is awful, this is so wrong, this is just not the way it's supposed to be. And then he gets to the last line of the text, and it comes out like this, but the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Full choir, everybody just shouting out this proclamation. And then I sat there thinking, man, Handel had it right. Because, you know, while we are in the midst of happily going about our own business and doing our own thing and running our own show, we are having a good time. And we're not feeling morose and guilty and awful. because we're not aware of what God has done for us. And I think that's the real impact of this verse. In fact, those two phrases, all we like sheep have gone astray. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And those phrases encompass the entire gospel. The whole story is summarized there in those two phrases. Let's continue on with verse 7 through 9. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is dumb, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. So these beginning lines of this verse are beginning to expand on this sheep metaphor that Isaiah actually had started in verse 6. So notice that when we are compared to sheep, it's to their nature to get themselves lost. That's what the comparison is for us. But when the servant of God is compared to sheep, it is to the submissive and to the non-defensive nature that he is compared. And this verse is likely the background to John the Baptist's cry when he said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." That he was oppressed and afflicted. Okay, so where am I at here? By oppression and judgment he was taken away. The question is, who has considered the injustice of this? It was totally unjust. He was cut off from the land of the living. In other words, this servant of God died childless in a culture where childbearing was considered one of God's greatest blessings. And this was another injustice that he experienced, a childless existence. And it says he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. So here we have a Hebrew parallelism. Assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. And this sort of parallelism, does it imply that the wicked and the rich are synonymous? That would be what you would naturally think when you read the poetry. That would be the natural inclination. And the Old Testament speaks often of wealth. The righteous are led to expect wealth as a reward, but on the other hand, wealth is not seen as a proof of righteousness. In fact, wealth is frequently associated with oppression. And so it's easiest probably to understand this verse as the rich, meaning the oppressors. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the oppressors in his death. So this then is a final irony of the servant's life. He is not even buried with the poor who had been his most faithful companions, but rather he is surrounded in death by those who had oppressed him and despised him, but those whose sins he also carried. In verse 9, we read, "Nor was any deceit found in his mouth." So here, the poet returns to the question about the mouth of God, of the servant. Like he had referred to the mouth in verse 7, he did not open his mouth. Here, not beyond not opening his mouth, he did open his mouth, and he spoke non-deceitful things. So in the midst of his suffering, he is able not just to be quiet, but to speak good. Even in the midst of his suffering. So the servant was not just submissive, he was innocent. And this clears up another mystery we have when we look at the suffering of the servant of God. How could someone suffer for others so that somehow it produced reconciliation in the relationship with God? How is that possible? You know, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die for myself. I can't die for somebody else. How is it possible that this person can die for someone else? Only someone who could say in all sincerity that has never rebelled against God would be able to die in the place of someone else. And finally, we come to the final stanza of this song. Remember, this is where everything has been headed. This is the longest stanza in the whole song. And we've answered many questions so far. You know, what is the meaning of this innocent man's submissive suffering in the place of sinners? That's one of the questions that has been raised. And why is he doing it? And how can he do it? And isn't it all just an accident of history? You know, and verse 10, we read in no unconditional terms that it was not an accident of history. It says, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great. He will divide spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So this verse begins with this, what we call a disjunctive contrast. Yet, it was the Lord's will to crush him. So how could all of these tragic injustices have happened to him? Perhaps it was just some meaningless, just part of the meaninglessness of life, you know? Maybe it was just an accident. And Isaiah says, no, not at all. The suffering of God's servant was no accident. It was God's will. So in a sense, that's like the worst answer possible, isn't it? Surely the faithful, good God would not bring bad things on this innocent servant, would he? Well, apparently, yes, he would. If something a greater good would be served. And the next clause gives us what that greater good is. The Lord makes his life an offering for sin. So suffering was not just one aspect of the servant's ministry, rather it was the entire purpose of his life and death, to suffer in the place of others. Now, it says the Lord makes his life an offering for sin. And the grammar here is a little bit ambiguous, and so it gives a couple of possible other alternative translations for this verse. So it could be, when he makes himself an offering for sin. That's the way the New Revised Standard Version and others translate it. It could also be if you make his soul a guilt offering. In other words, you the reader, make him a guilt offering. So, I mean, the question is, who is the one who is making this servant into the offering? Is it the Lord making his servant an offering? Is it the servant making himself an offering? Or is it you making the servant an offering? Those are the options grammatically that are given to us in this text. In the context, it would seem as if the last is the most reasonable. It is you and I who make Jesus an offering for sin. When the Old Testament believer would bring a sacrifice for sin, there were a number of different types of offerings that they would bring, and one in particular was called the guilt offering. And this was the most personal because it was for a sin that you yourself had done, and you knew you had done it, and you were repenting of it, and you wanted to turn away from it and be forgiven. This is not some generalized sin of the people. This is not some sin of, I think I probably did something wrong sometime, and so let's just bring an offering. But it was a specific guilt. And as you would bring the lamb usually, or it could be some other kinds of animals, you would bring it into the tabernacle or the temple, and you would place your hand upon that animal. And then the Levite would slit its throat, and the blood would spray all around. And you had your hand on the animal, identifying with him. This animal is dying for me. Well, that made your sin very personal, didn't it? And you understood the gravity of what was being demanded of your soul. And that is what the picture is here. We take our hand and we place it on the bloodied head of Jesus. And we say, this was for me. And God, I am offering this offering for my guilt. And the amazing thing is, that is the climax of God's drama of salvation. Mm-hmm. It doesn't climax at the cross. It doesn't even climax at the resurrection. The climax of God's drama of salvation happens when you and I identify with Jesus and we say, this was for me. And God accepts that. And he changes you. And that is, you and I, we get to make God's salvation plan work. We get to bring his plan to fruition. That is what it says here. The will of the Lord, let's see, find it here. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. So the servant will accomplish God's purpose for his life. And this will come not as a result of his preaching, nor his living a good example, nor being humble in adversity, but only when you and I make his sacrificial offering our own. And that is when the entire drama of salvation comes to its conclusion. Notice here it says in verse 10, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. Isn't that just the opposite of what we just talked about, that he was going to die childless? But far from living a completely futile life, here he is described as living the most fruitful life possible. And he will see the light of life and be satisfied, it says in verse 11. And notice, he will see the light of life. This is after he's already suffered death. It seems to me a rather strong implication of a resurrection. And after all he has suffered, the servant will be satisfied with the outcome when many are made righteous. And the results will be worth the great personal cost to him. He will be satisfied. Verse 11 also says, by his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many. Now, this phrase, by his knowledge, probably should actually be joined with the phrase that comes just before. It would read better that way. Let's see if I can find it here. He will see the light of life and be satisfied by his knowledge. My righteous servant will justify many. So here's the startling truth. The servant's suffering will actually make people righteous. Unlike the faithful followers in the sacrificial system who could only be seen as clean before God because they offered the prescribed sacrifices, those who accept the suffering of God's servant as a substitute for their sins can become truly clean. And their fellowship with God is restored. And the reason this sacrifice is more effective than the Old Testament sacrifice is that an animal can never truly substitute for another person. Only Jesus Christ, who is a human, can give his life in our place. What's more, Jesus is more than human. He's also God. And in that sense, his death can be even more effective because it can be effective not just for one, but all who identify before God with his sacrifice. His death is effective for them as well. Verse 12 says, therefore, I will give him a portion among the great. This therefore reminds us of Philippians 2, where Paul has described Christ's great condescension and his suffering. And then he states, therefore, God exalted him to the highest place.
Amen.
And this verse is a summary of the entire servant song. It starts with the conclusion first, God's exaltation. And then it gives the cause second, because he poured out his life unto death. And by placing that cause of the servant's exaltation last, it gives it a greater prominence. I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong. God rewards his servants as if they were kings sharing the spoils of a great victory. And the servant's song now has come full circle, returning to its opening statement, my servant will be raised and lifted high and highly exalted. He poured out his life unto death. Jesus denied all the natural instincts he had for survival and allowed his physical life to be taken away. He was numbered with the transgressors. In other words, he allowed himself to be listed among the rebels and thus died as one of them. And for this he was exalted, you may ask. But Jesus did not simply die with the rebels. He died for the rebels, and that's what makes the difference. And he bore the sin of many. This is the reason the servant poured out his life. So, as I mentioned earlier, you know, the Jewish person reading through this chapter would not have truly understood who we're talking about. That would have been the overwhelming question, who is this servant? You and I have this piercing recognition, don't we? We can see that this is Jesus. And the Apostle Peter has made that understanding very plain in 1 Peter chapter 2. even though we can fully identify this servant as Jesus, we haven't lost all mystery. There are still questions. The question that remains for us is not, who is this servant? The question that we have is, how could he possibly love us this much?
Yeah.
Would you pray with me? Upon the cross of Jesus, my eyes at times can see the very dying form of one who suffered there for me. And from my smitten heart, with tears, two wonders I confess: the wonders of redeeming love and my unworthiness. Oh, Father, we are left speechless, just like those kings that are spoken of in this chapter. Who were appalled at what he looked like. But we are appalled at your love, Lord. We are amazed that you would love us this much. And while we don't have the mystery of who the servant is, we certainly have the mystery of why in the world he would love us this much. And this is a mystery that I think we will never come to the bottom of. God, I pray that you would take this amazement that we have and this wonder, and that you would receive it as worship, you would receive it as praise. We are offering it to you in the name of this wonderful servant, Jesus. Amen.